On a frozen ridge in the northern Ural Mountains, 9 experienced mountaineers did something unthinkable. In sub-zero darkness, they slashed open their tent from the inside and walked into a lethal blizzard, without coats, without boots, and without survival gear. These were not reckless novices. The expedition, led by 23-year-old radio engineering student Igor Dyatlov, consisted of 8 men and 2 women from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. All were seasoned mountaineers pursuing their Grade 3 certification, the highest tier of difficulty in the Soviet Union, requiring a 300-kilometer trek across trackless wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to acute joint pain, leaving 9 hikers to continue toward Mount Otorten. On February 26, 1959, search teams finally located their abandoned camp on the desolate eastern shoulder of Kholat Syakhl, known in the indigenous Mansi language as Dead Mountain. The expedition's canvas tent lay collapsed and half-buried in drifting snow on the barren slope. Its heavy fabric had not torn under the wind. Forensic analysis revealed multiple clean, vertical cuts sliced open from the inside out. The hikers had not attempted to unbutton the lashed entrance. Facing an immediate threat, they sliced through the wall to escape into the open night. Inside the tent, their gear remained fully intact. Quilted jackets, felt boots, rucksacks, navigational maps, and cameras were neatly arranged. A partially consumed meal of salt pork lay sliced on a camp stove, while a single flashlight rested switched off atop the snow-covered roof. Down the slope from the collapsed shelter, the physical evidence grew stranger. Preserved in the wind-scoured crust were 8 to 9 distinct sets of footprints descending the slope toward the tree line, nearly 1.5 kilometers away. These tracks showed no signs of panic, running, or scattered flight. Instead, the hikers walked shoulder to shoulder at a steady, deliberate pace. Yet the physical reality of their condition was severe. Several wore only thin socks, while others were entirely barefoot in temperatures estimated between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius. There were no secondary tracks, no footprints of other humans, no predator trails, and no signs of physical struggle. Nothing remained except the hikers' own fading steps descending into the dark expanse of the mountain. The tracks led straight toward the dark tree line, 1,500 meters below, where searchers would find the first bodies. Following the barefoot tracks down the mountain, search parties reached the edge of the dense taiga forest, roughly 1,500 meters from the abandoned camp. Under the sweeping boughs of an ancient Siberian cedar tree, searchers uncovered the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both men lay side by side in deep snow, stripped down to their thermal underwear and socks. Beside them sat the blackened embers of a small, crude campfire built from birch and pine twigs. The cedar above them revealed an agonizing struggle. Thick branches were snapped off up to 5 meters above the ground, while fragments of skin and clothing remained embedded in the bark. Both hikers suffered severe friction burns and abrasions across their hands and legs, indicating they had climbed the rough bark to break dry branches, shield themselves from ground winds, or scan the dark ridge for their lost shelter. Between the cedar and the ridge camp, searchers found 3 more hikers spaced along a straight trajectory: Igor Dyatlov, Rustam Slobodin, and Zenaida Kolmogorova. Each lay face down in the snowpack, pointing uphill toward the mountain summit. Dyatlov was discovered 300 meters from the cedar. Slobodin lay 480 meters out, and Kolmogorova was found furthest uphill at 630 meters. Their alignment indicated a coordinated effort to climb back up the frozen slope toward their shelter and gear before extreme cold overcame them. When Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny performed autopsies in early March 1959, the findings confirmed that all 5 had succumbed to primary hypothermia. The examinations documented Vishnevsky spots, distinct dark hemorrhagic patches along the stomach lining that serve as a textbook forensic indicator of fatal cold shock. Although Slobodin had sustained a 6-centimeter non-displaced fracture to his skull, Vozrojdeny ruled that the closed cranial injury was non-fatal. Extreme cold had claimed all 5. Yet 4 mountaineers were still missing. For more than 2 months, their bodies remained hidden beneath 4 meters of frozen snowpack. In early May 1959, warming temperatures began cutting through the winter snowpack. Nearly 3 months after the disaster, search teams probing deep in a ravine 75 meters southwest of the Cedar struck buried fabric beneath 4 meters of dense, packed snow. Digging into the frozen trench, searchers uncovered the remains of the final 4 hikers: Semyon Zolotaryov, Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. At the bottom of the ravine lay clear proof of a disciplined survival operation. The hikers had constructed a raised platform from 14 small fir and birch saplings, covering it with spare clothing to insulate themselves from the frozen ground. The garments revealed how the survivors operated. They had salvaged clothing from Doroshenko and Krivonishenko after their companions perished near the Cedar. Dubinina's foot was wrapped in pieces of Krivonishenko's scorched wool trousers, while Zolotaryov wore a fleece jacket and cap belonging to the fallen men. When Dr. Vozrojdeny conducted autopsies on these 4 bodies, the hypothermia theory collapsed. What he uncovered was catastrophic internal trauma, crushed rib cages, and shattered skulls with no external skin wounds. Semyon Zolotaryov had 5 crushed ribs along his right chest wall, causing massive internal bleeding. Lyudmila Dubinina suffered bilateral rib fractures, 10 broken ribs on her left side and 2 on her right, which had punctured her heart and lungs, filling her chest cavity with blood. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol presented a massive depressed skull fracture along his temporal and parietal bones. Forensically, the most perplexing finding was the absence of external trauma. Despite severe skeletal fractures, the victims showed virtually no bruising, lacerations, or impact marks. Their skeletal frames had been crushed from within by an immense uniform force rather than strikes from blunt weapons. Furthermore, Dubinina was missing her tongue, soft palate, eyes, and upper lip, while Zolotaryov was missing his ocular tissue. Dr. Vozrojdeny recorded that the force required to produce such catastrophic internal fractures was comparable to the impact of a high-velocity car crash. With no external soft tissue damage and no weapon marks, Soviet investigators faced a forensic anomaly they could not explain with 1950s methods. In late May of 1959, Soviet regional prosecutor Lev Ivanov abruptly closed the investigation. His final summary stated that the hikers had perished due to an elemental force which they were unable to overcome. With no individual held responsible, case file number 659 was stamped secret, locked in regional archives and hidden from public view. That institutional silence sparked 6 decades of speculation. When the case files were declassified years later, researchers discovered a startling detail. Investigator Ivanov had ordered specialized radiation screenings on tissue and clothing samples recovered from the ravine. The laboratory tests revealed that specific swatches of fabric, notably Krivonishenko's sweater and Kolovatov's jacket, exhibited elevated levels of low-intensity beta radiation. To alternative theorists, this suggested secret missile launches, nuclear fallout, or clandestine military tests conducted near the mountain. However, the physical distribution of the isotopes contradicts a weapons scenario. The radiation was strictly localized and faint, showing none of the widespread fallout signatures that would have uniformly contaminated the entire campsite and surrounding terrain. Instead, the readings matched the hikers' civilian careers. Georgy Krivonishenko was an engineer at the Mayak Production Association in Chelyabinsk 40, a major plutonium processing plant that suffered the massive Kishtum nuclear disaster in 1957. Alexander Kolovatov worked in a Moscow nuclear physics research laboratory. Both men routinely worked in environments where low-level industrial isotopes contaminated everyday clothing.
Additionally, the team carried camping lanterns equipped with thorium-impregnated mantles, which naturally shed alpha and beta particles onto nearby fabrics during routine handling. The radioactive traces pointed to ordinary laboratory exposure, not a secret weapon test. But that eliminated the military explanation without solving the crime scene. What physical force could drive 9 experts into sub-zero night and crush human bone without leaving a bruise?
For decades, conventional avalanche theories were dismissed by mountaineers and Soviet investigators alike. The slope angle on Kholat Syakhl, where Dyatlov pitched the tent, was roughly 23 degrees, well below the 30 to 45 degree threshold where large-scale avalanches normally occur. When searchers arrived weeks later, the tent poles remained upright and the surrounding terrain showed none of the sprawling debris tracks characteristic of a major snowslide. Modern geotechnical analysis reveals that the hikers had unknowingly armed a silent mechanical trigger. To shelter their camp from fierce western winds, the mountaineers cut a flat shelf directly into the snowpack to level the tent floor. This cut severed the base support of a cohesive, wind-hardened snow slab resting over an unstable layer of granular depth hoar crystals. Over the following hours, heavy katabatic winds, dense, gravity-driven currents sweeping down the mountain, deposited tons of drift snow onto the slope above the cut. This continuous accumulation built up intense shear stress across the weakened snowpack. In 2021, geotechnical researchers Alexander Puzrin and Johann Gaume published a detailed physical model in the journal Nature Communications that tested this specific terrain. Using three-dimensional numerical simulations and snowpack fracture dynamics, they proved that a localized snow slab could break free on a 23-degree slope hours after being excavated. The simulation demonstrated that when the weak basal layer sheared along the cut, a dense, cohesive slab of hard snow, approximately 5 meters long, slid downward and struck the tent roof. It was not a massive powder avalanche, but a localized slab of compacted snow that dropped directly onto the occupied tent. The impact collapsed the canvas, pinned the occupants in darkness, and inflicted initial blunt trauma. Assuming a larger slope collapse was underway, the trapped hikers cut through the canvas walls to escape immediately into the sub-zero darkness. Once out of the crushed tent, the 9 mountaineers faced an immediate battle for survival. In wind chills exceeding minus 40 degrees Celsius, staying on the exposed ridge meant dying of exposure within minutes. Igor Dyatlov and his team executed a disciplined, tactical retreat down the mountain fall line toward the forest, where trees offered shelter from the wind and fuel for a fire. At the cedar tree, the group split their efforts. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko tended the fire, struggling through freezing limbs to gather wood. Recognizing that the small fire was insufficient against the gale, Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova attempted to make their way back up the ridge to retrieve boots, coats, and sleeping bags. One by one, severe hypothermia overwhelmed them on the open slope. Meanwhile, the remaining 4 hikers retreated into the adjacent ravine to build a protected snow den, carpeting the floor with cut boughs and salvaging clothes from their fallen friends. But this shelter triggered a second structural disaster. The heavy snowpack drifting over the ravine bank overloaded the natural snow bridge spanning the narrow creek bed. Tons of hard, compacted snow collapsed without warning, slamming down onto the den and crushing the 4 survivors against the rocky stream bed below. This dynamic compressive load generated the massive rib fractures and internal cranial trauma seen in the autopsies, injuries identical to industrial crush accidents where enormous static weight shatters bones without tearing the outer skin. This also explains the missing facial tissue on Lyudmila Dubinina. When the den collapsed, the bodies were buried directly inside an active mountain stream. Submerged in running spring meltwater for nearly 3 months, natural post-mortem taphonomy occurred. Flowing water, moisture and microbial activity gradually decomposed the softest mucous membranes and ocular tissue long before search teams reached the ravine in May. The tragedy on Kholat Syakhl was neither a military cover-up nor paranormal folklore. It was a lethal cascade of natural mechanics. An excavated snowpack, a delayed slab collapse, an emergency flight into sub-zero winds, and a final cave-in inside the ravine. Through modern forensic analysis and mechanical modeling, the historical record is restored. 9 disciplined mountaineers who supported one another through an unprecedented series of alpine hazards. The past rarely gives us simple answers. It gives us clues. For more ancient mysteries decoded through forensic evidence, stay with the channel.